My name is Harri. Kalimo. I'm a professor here at the Brussels School of Governance, a 3 research center, and I'm organizing this together with colleagues Harri de Ville from Ghent University and Simon Happersberger from BSoG. Great pleasure to have you all with us. And we acknowledge here at the outset the generous funding for organizing this from the Commission's Erasmus Jean Monnet program, the Equivalence Project finances. Now, the idea of Harri, Simon, and myself in this is that we wanted to have a set of events that discuss the many things that are happening in EU's trade policy, EU's external policies. The EU launched in winter 2021 a new, more assertive, sustainable trade strategy. Seems already like a long time ago, in fact. And that strategy was described at the time as a response to a world which had become more geopolitical, more geo-economical, one could say. Various interests of the EU seem to be threatened or requiring more assertive approach, whether regarding to commerce, the environment, or perhaps the security. And so the EU set up a more assertive approach, using terms such as strategic autonomy in its approach. And after that, since that time frame, the EU is then engaged in a pretty active legislative agenda where various legal instruments have been put and moved ahead in implementation of this strategy. And so when looking at these instruments, we as researchers got interested and were wondering whether this new shift is a mark of something where the EU's role in the world might have changed. Some say, at least, that the EU has become more unilateral. The old bastion of multilateralism, the European Union, turning more towards itself, becoming more a solitary actor. And that's the puzzle, that's a question we want to investigate in this series of events. What does it mean, in fact, to be unilateral? How does one see that? What implications will such a change have? And conceptually and practically better understand this notion. We'll have a series of 4 events unfolding now over the next few months, every second a week, an event seeking to look into 8 specific policy instruments relating to this topic, and specifically 3 themes: leveling the playing field, sustainability, and geopolitics. And these will be introduced here in this session today, because today we have the first introductory session to this overall series of events. And indeed, because it's an introduction, we need a very eminent group of scholars and experts to guide us through that. And so I'm very, very pleased to have with us here this afternoon such a astonishing group, I have to say. Starting from the left, we have Peter Sandler. Maybe I'll actually move here so that the camera will hopefully follow me, so that people actually see whom I'm introducing. Let's see if this works. Yes, it does. Very good. So Peter is one of the most experienced trade lawyers in the Commission in DG Trade. So we're very glad to have him take us through the Commission's strategy. His equivalent from the French permanent representation, Claire Cheremetinsky, equally a very, very distinguished and experienced trade expert, a diplomat who's been looking and who's currently a minister counselor in the French permanent rep here in Brussels. So great to have you here with us as well, Claire. Marko Keinen, my compatriot Finn, who is the permanent representative of Finland here in Brussels. So another member state, but a bit of a different perspective. And I should mention that France was the previous president, had the presidency in the EU. So therefore also an interesting country to have with us. Marko, in addition to being the permanent representative, is also a very, very seasoned trade expert. So in that sense, excellent to have you with us. And then finally online, and not being able to join us today in person, but virtually, Steve Coe, who is giving us a bit of an outside view, private sector. So working for the Eking Gum law firm, whose clients are mostly non-European enterprises or other clients. So very interesting, Steve, to hear from you also how these European policies see you. Now, finally, to guide us and to moderate the discussion, and a bit of an outside view, I guess, because it's a Switzerland as a current label for Professor Joos Paavonen, an eminent international law scholar, star in that field, who is here at the 3E Research Center as a visitor. So we are very pleased and privileged to have him here for this autumn conducting his research. And of course, having somebody like him around, we will immediately grab him and make use of his expertise and have him act as a moderator for this type of expert audience. So that being said, we invite questions from the audience online. So please use the chat function. We'll try to get questions from there as well, mix them into the questions and to the debate we have here in the room. And as I said, the session is recorded up until the first 45 minutes or so. I think with that, so the floor is yours, Justin.
Okay, I think I'll speak from here. This will be easiest if the camera can follow me.
I think, yes, we can do that, but perhaps the moderation is easier on place because then everybody is remains on the camera.
You want to be seated while speaking, or you want to come to the podium? Seated is fine. Okay, then I might as well sit and speak from here. Okay, this seems to work. Thank you, Harri, for introducing all of us. It's a real pleasure to meet all of you and to moderate the discussion. As you said, I'm normally based in Geneva, where I'm a professor and a practitioner of trade law. And indeed, the reason I decided to come to Brussels for my sabbatical is exactly this amazing storm of activity coming out of the EU Commission, the many new proposals, regulations, whereby the EU is trying to reshape the international trade landscape. And yes, I think we'll have a bit of a discussion on whether this is unilateralism, autonomous, multilateral. But in any event, I find it as an outsider extremely interesting to see what's coming out of Brussels. And to be fair, I think the activity in Brussels is a lot more exciting than the activity in Geneva these days. So delighted to be here and hear directly from participants in this field where this is going. So you mentioned that this is an introductory event, and the goal of the discussion today is to give an overview of the various initiatives that the EU has put on the table and to see whether there's a red line through all of these initiatives, whether something binds them together. Why is this popping up? Is this a good thing, a bad thing, something in between? And we will start off with Peter, who will take a little bit more time to introduce all of these initiatives, and we will then turn to commentators one by one. Peter?
Thanks very much, Joss. Thanks, Harri, for the invitation, and delighted to be here. What I'll try and do over the next few minutes maybe is just talk a little bit about the Commission's strategy, the overall strategy, the trade policy review that Harri mentioned. Talk a little bit about the toolbox and some of the instruments that will be considered over the following sessions, but also highlighting one or two other instruments as well, which I think are relevant. And then finally give you a bit of a sense of what are some of the conclusions or the elements that we're drawing from what we've been doing so far. The starting point, as you suggested, is very much the trade policy review that was adopted in February 2020, based on openness, based on assertiveness, and based on sustainability. The underlying question for this series of sessions was the Commission abandoning multilateralism? Were we giving up on the WTO? Were we putting too much emphasis on the bilateral track? Were we going down the route solely of looking at legal instruments? The answer is an emphatic no. We were not abandoning multilateralism. I think for us, it's absolutely essential, even more essential now in the way the world has changed over the last year, to have a stable and predictable environment in which trade can take place. And the best way of doing that is through a rules-based framework. But more than that, it's part of the European Union's DNA. We built on 27 countries coming together, building a framework to work together, to trade together, etc. And you can see through the commitment, the energy that the European Union and the member states brought into the last ministerial conference of the WTO. You can see through the push that we've done to create an alternative to the WTO dispute settlement system, which is blocked, where the appeal mechanism is blocked at the moment. And we've got an agreement of key WTO players, short of the US, to provide a stopgap appeal mechanism while we try to find a longer term solution. We also, of course, remain fully committed to the bilateral agenda. We've got a number of agreements in the oven. We're trying to complete the process of baking them and getting them adopted with Latin America. We've got a number of negotiations which are moving ahead with Australia, with India. So the bilateral track is very much strong and alive. And the bilateral angle of our trade policy is even more important. The idea of getting more market access is even more important in the current context, where we are having this complete disconnect from Russia, and the dependence that we've seen on Russia for raw materials, certainly critical raw materials for energy, plays into that. I think one of the questions which will play out through the different sessions is whether assertiveness is the same as unilateralism. And I think we would argue that that's not the case. We have developed, and I'll go on to touch on that, a series of autonomous measures, new tools which can allow the EU to act when it has to act, but we still act within the rules. We're very careful in designing instruments, and if we weren't doing it, the member states would make sure that we were doing it in discussions around, for example, the new anti-coercion instrument that we've proposed, to make sure that we stay within the international framework. And that is a very important part of the logic of a rules-based system. At the same time, I recognize that one man's assertiveness could easily be taken as someone else's unilateralism, and that is going to be the dynamic, if you like, that will play out, I suspect, through all the sessions. So we've been rebalancing the set of instruments the EU has at its disposal, recognizing that in many cases, to work with big partners, think the US, think China, we need to have sufficient leverage to be able to help ensure the right sort of outcomes which stand up for European interests. But equally, we have to meet an expectation that our trade agreements will actually deliver results where we've got them, whether it's the multilateral commitments or the bilateral commitments, that these agreements will work. And that requires you to make sure that you're spending time ensuring that the rules are applied and implemented. But equally that we can project and stand up for EU values, very often aligned to international standards like international labour standards or multilateral environmental agreements, the Paris Agreement and those kind of things. So what's in our toolbox? What's coming up? I mean, there are a few things. I've mentioned the multilateral track. We're firmly committed to that. We recognise that there's scope to reform the WTO, but fundamentally, that is the show that we want to keep at the centre of things. The bilateral agenda, as I mentioned, is moving forward. But we've also been looking over a number of years at strengthening the legal instruments that we have at our disposal. There are kind of three blocks that I would highlight. The first block is linked to the level playing field, which is one of the sessions. And these are where we have tools which are about getting more value, more leverage from the internal market that we have within the European Union, with a view to getting a level playing field against other players, getting access to other markets. So, for example, there's an instrument called the International Procurement Instrument, which creates a mechanism by which we can potentially use the possibility of closing some access or limiting access to the EU's procurement market, which is completely open at the moment. We use that to get more access in third countries. It's about getting more access elsewhere. It's not about closing the EU market. There are a set of instruments built around sustainability and sustainable development, which is a key priority in terms of this commission, greening the commission's agenda, and it feeds into trade policy as well. 11 of the bilateral agreements we have at the moment have trade and sustainable development chapters. But on top of that, we are doing things like, as a result of a big reform of how we approach trade and sustainable development, we're doing things to look at how we can give more force to certain provisions like the Paris Agreement, or attempts by partners to undermine the Paris Agreement or not to respect the fundamental principles of the International Labour Organization, with the possibility at the end of the journey eventually of applying some kind of sanctions in cases where there are breaches after a process which would establish that the rules are not being applied. More engagement with civil society and different actors. We're reforming the general scheme of preferences, which we give to developing countries, least developed countries. We have, outside the direct trade area, we've introduced rules for carbon border adjustment measure. This is effectively something to level the playing field in a non-discriminatory way, in a WTO compatible way, between the charges which are collected at the moment inside the European Union for the emissions trading scheme and products which would be coming in from other countries, with lots of elements built into that to ensure that there's an international discussion around this, and we can work with external partners to try and find solutions that can allow trade to flow unhindered, but paying the cost that is necessary. And with recent proposals as well on sustainability related to forced labour, related to deforestation, in both cases aiming to prevent products produced through forced labour or commodities which might have been grown or reared on land which is the result of deforestation from being on the market within the European Union. So the sustainability strand, there's a whole set of actions and new ones which we're putting in place. And then finally, on the geopolitical side, we have a number of different areas where the Commission has been active. We have something called the enforcement regulation. This is essentially a framework which allows the European Union to take action against partner countries that fail to implement the results of bilateral disputes or the results of a WTO panel after it's run its full course, or that potentially if they decide to block the WTO process. For example, today with the appeal mechanism blocked, a country, if they lose a case with the EU, simply need to say, I appeal that case, and then it disappears into the void. This measure would allow us at that stage to step in and say, that's not right, it's not fair, and to impose compensatory measures against the country concerned. We have a set of instruments which we refer to as our sticks, our strategic trade and investment controls. This is export control, this is foreign direct investment screening, ways in which, for security reasons, we're able to place legitimate restrictions on trade or potentially give advice to countries that are looking at particular investments which are coming in. Very important to see these in terms of security-based measures. They're not industrial policy, they're not about competitiveness. Those angles considered in other channels. And then there's also the proposal I mentioned before in terms of the anti-coercion instrument, which is a framework which would allow us to react to situations where trade bullies attempt to change the policy of the European Union or of the member states by applying economic measures to us, whether formal or informal measures. We've seen the drama at the start of this year in relation to Lithuania and China. There may be ways through that, through the WTO, but the anti-coercion instrument is an alternative route in cases where different countries go beyond the limits of international law in terms of how they try to influence or shape decisions which might be taken within the European Union. So the final point, just to give you a sense of some of our initial, not conclusions, but the experience so far. It's quite clear to say, I think we remain committed in terms of the multilateral outlook, the rules-based outlook, but nevertheless, we focused more responding to member states, responding to the European Parliament on some of the instruments, the legal toolbox, to rebalance, if you like, the distribution of possibilities to influence in disputes. Secondly, the basic stance in being more assertive is still one based on openness. That is the starting point for the and the assertiveness angle is a way of complementing what we do through the multilateral track, through the bilateral track in terms of trade negotiations, trying to grow the trade pie, but of course something which is increasingly difficult in the current international context. Third issue is ensuring that we have instruments which work, that they're balanced, that there's a degree of proportionality, that the instruments we develop, such as the anti-coercion instrument, is designed in a way where people know that if the union goes down that track, it can actually be used, and it will be used in an effective way, and won't be subject to the coercion of the country you're trying to address on the member states to stop decisions actually being taken. We are also trying to ensure that we have instruments which can take account of the needs of business, but also take account of the fact that businesses have different levels of resource, and the position of SMEs and multinationals is very, very different. A fourth point is the security perspective and the context that we've seen, the developments we've seen over the last 9 months. I think from one perspective, you learn from that the value of collective action within the European Union, but also the European Union with other partners, and the sort of action that has been taken on sanctions in cooperation with the US, the UK, Japan, and other partners shows the value of a coherent process where you can develop that sort of consensus around action that needs to be taken individually by the different countries, but nevertheless closely aligned, whilst at the same time keeping the view that this is about security concerns, and it's not a disguised way of developing a industrial policy or a competitiveness policy. But that said, the lines between these different strands of policy blur, and that's again something maybe we'll talk more about. All of this, if you were to summarize, comes back to something, Harri, you mentioned, the idea of open strategic autonomy, the idea that the union will act multilaterally wherever it can, but is ready to act autonomously where it is necessary. I'll stop there.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Peter, for a great introduction overview from the EU Commission as to, first of all, what the EU Commission, what the EU is doing, the common denominator that binds these instruments. And if I understand you correctly, it's establishing a legal toolbox that you can use without the agreement of other trading partners. So it's unilateral in that sense. And the reason for establishing this is indeed a stalemate in Geneva at the multilateral level, and also pursuing objectives of geopolitical needs, sustainability, and building in some more reciprocity, leveling of the playing field. Now, this is the EU initiating, proposing all of these initiatives. Of course, the EU has 27 member states. It must be really difficult to pull this off, to find agreement on all of these instruments. And to animate the discussion a bit, and without putting you up as strawmen to fight each other, I think what is really interesting is that we will hear a French perspective, and I think I'm fair when I say that France has initiated some of these new trends and is very supportive, generally speaking. And then we'll hear from the Finnish ambassador with perhaps a bit more of a critical perspective. But we'll start with you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jos. Thank you, Harri, and thanks, Peter, for this very comprehensive introduction. In fact, you have said already everything, but I just would like to add a few points from the perspective of a member state which indeed has been a supporter for a long time of developing this toolbox. Let me just add a few things on the discussion you've made, Peter, on whether or not this is unilateralism. And my point is just like you to say that indeed, I don't think we are turning to unilateralism. Actually, I mean, as a member state, as a country, middle-sized country, middle-sized economy, the world that we have now, we do not have any choice but to be in favor of multilateralism and trying to keep the multilateral system working and relevant, because otherwise this is the law of the strongest and we are not the strongest. So this is our strategic interest, to keep the multilateral system on track. And that's why we are so happy to have this commission, working very hard, for instance, at the last WTO ministerial conference. And as always, the European Commission was instrumental in managing to come out of this ministerial conference with a much better result that we might have expected in the first place. So keeping the multilateral system in place is our strategic interest, and we will continue to work in that direction. Second point I wanted to make is that indeed EU trade policy has evolved quite dramatically, actually, in the past few years, but not to move to unilateralism, but to rebalance towards being more assertive, and that's what you've explained, Peter. And there is a big difference. The difference being that our toolbox is actually consistent with all our international commitments, and we do not take any kind of actions which would be contrary to WTO rules or to any other international law for that matter. So, and that's a big difference with other countries, which I will not name, but I think you understand who I'm talking about. So this is a very important point, I think, and this is why in no sense we can be considered as moving towards unilateralism from my point of view. The reason why we have to make this rebalancing of the EU trade policy is mostly because actually, indeed, we need to rely on a common rules-based system and on a common rule book. But the problem we have is that it's not the case for all our partners. They don't rely necessarily on the common rule book, and they act in autonomous manner, in unilateral ways that are not consistent with the rule book. And sometimes the rule book is not able to tackle what they are doing, simply because, for instance, now in the WTO, we don't have a dispute settlement system that works. So that's one point. But I mean, you have other example and other drawbacks in the international set of rules that actually lead us to think that we need to have our own autonomous toolbox. Other reason why we need to do this rebalancing, I think Peter have explained very well that one of the objectives is to make progress towards leveling up, leveling the ground for our companies and not having differences in competitive environment that would put European companies at a disadvantage. So that's one point. I will not explain further because Peter has done that very well. Second reason why we needed to make this evolution is the fact that we wanted to have some instruments that could have a deterrent effect. Why did we need that? Because actually we were evolving in an environment where other actors took hostile actions or were not acting in a fair way towards Europe. And a lot of our instruments that we are developing in the toolbox, actually, their interest is not, they are not meant to be used, or they are not meant to be used on a common basis. Maybe we will have to use them, but their interests rely mainly on the fact that they exist and that partners know that we can use them if we need to. And if you took the anti-coercion instrument, that's the perfect example of that. But it's also the case for other instruments, and we might come back to that later on. Another reason why I think this rebalancing was indeed necessary is the fact that the international set of rules indeed may not be up to date and indeed is very slow to adapt. If you look at WTO fundamental rule books, you will perfectly understand that we think that things need to be changed, but it will take a long time. For instance, if you take the question of public subsidies, we do have an anti-subsidy agreement at the WTO, but we think it is not really working to tackle widespread subsidies in very big economies. And that's why we thought it was necessary to have this anti-subsidy instrument at the level of the EU, because actually our companies were suffering very much from actors coming from third countries where subsidies are everywhere in the economy. So we had to act on an autonomous manner simply because the multilateral toolbox was not adapting quickly enough to the new situation. One last reason why I think this rebalancing has been done is also because Europe, in a way, become more aware of the fact that trade policy is a very powerful instrument for the EU to reach out to third countries. And actually, this is the only common policy that we have in order to deal with third countries. We do actually progress on having a common diplomacy. We also are making efforts to have a common defense policy. We're not there yet, but we are making huge progress, which were not even remotely thought as possible only a few months ago. But still, trade is the only sphere where we do have a common policy, and a very powerful one. And therefore, Europe has become conscious of the fact that through trade policy, we could indeed project our values or project policy action courses where we do think that it is in the common interest of, not only EU country, but the whole world. So this is what we are doing, for instance, on our trade and sustainable development action. So you've probably seen the recent communication from the Commission in that respect. And this is also the case where we are taking anti-deforestation instrument or forced labor instrument, just like the one the Commission has just issued. So, I think as European, we can be proud of that. Of course, as Peter said, autonomous measures from some are considered as unilateralism for others. Well, I would tend to think that when Europe pursues universal objectives such as fighting against forced labor, for instance, this is perfectly legitimate. That may be a point of discussion for later on. And I would end by just saying that indeed we are going to continue to have bilateral trade agreements. We have indeed on our plates already almost concluded bilateral agreements and others which are being negotiated. So that's a fact. But it's also a fact that for our civil society, our national parliament, the European Parliament, it is not acceptable anymore to conclude trade agreements without having a look at how business is conducted in partner countries. That's simply not possible. So that would not happen in the future. So we need to take that into account. And I think that's exactly what the Commission is doing through the rebalancing of its trade strategy. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks a lot. Really interesting to go already a bit deeper. I don't sense any disagreements yet, but listening to you, it's interesting how one could ask the question, why is the EU doing this now? Listening to you, you could ask the question, why did it take so long for the EU to step up and be more assertive, as you've explained, because that's their common policy. That's something they can move on quickly. Why did it take so long for the EU to become a bit more assertive? I'm turning now to Mark, who is the permanent representative of Finland, and I think may have a slightly different view, although I'm sure a very diplomatic different view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joost and Peter. And Claire, actually, already Harri raised the bar quite high, and previous speakers made it even higher. As regards multilateralism, I can fully agree with what Claire said, actually. So that if you said that you are a middle-sized country, it's a surprise to me. So that even then for a small country, multilateralism is the real thing. And so that we are really true believers on multilateralism. Because if we end up to an intergovernmental type of a system, a small country loses totally. And that is one of the reasons we are great friends of the Commission always, because Commission represents also views of small countries and all EU countries. We have a shared interest, as very well has been outlined here, to trade more and to achieve more trade contracts. So that EU is a superpower in trade. And good that we have qualified majority voting in that field, because it helps. So that as regards multilateralism, full support what has been said here, so that we have to continue on that path. It has had certain hiccups and along the way, but it is still there. And quite surprisingly, actually, the last WTO ministerial conference could reach results. But there are problems, and we need other ways as well. We need our bilateral agreements to correct issues. Then about this EU's trade strategy and that how we have moved to this assertiveness. I still remember when we moved to the word assertive, we first had robust. Then we invented assertive. I'm interested to hear that what will be the third adjective when we go to that road. And it also shows a bit the change in our Northern liberal thinking, because I remember that European Council, we opposed the word robust. And then it was the third European Council, we gave up, okay, robust. But that only shows how much our thinking has shifted, perhaps a bit more to this assertive French side, and the world has changed. So that in that respect, times are now different. But after saying this, we still, as Northern trade liberal country, feel strongly that we shouldn't go too far with this assertiveness in a way. And perhaps you asked why it took so long time. It may be one reason is that we opposed quite fiercely to move to that direction for years. And now we have on table instruments actually opposing before, like this public procurement. The Northern thinking was and is still a little bit that fine, this is a deterrent issue. But we were a bit afraid that if the deterrent word won't function, then we are in a war, in a trade war. And that may cause difficulties to all of us. while fully acknowledging that we need these deterrence instruments. But that is the other side of it. Are we ready for it, to use it? Are we ready for nuclear war with Russia, for example? So we would still like to keep the line there that we have to remain open as well, and Peter has very nicely referred in many occasions to this openness as well. So this is the history. And when we come to trade agreements, yes, we need them, but then we have one problem, that we don't ratify these agreements in our national parliaments. And that is perhaps something for the further discussion, that what should we do that these agreements will be ratified. We agreed 5 years ago CETA agreement with Canada, one of the countries which is the most like-minded to Europe, and only 16 member states have ratified that agreement. Then when we come to more difficult but different parts of the world, how long will it take them? And if trade policy is our crown jewel, and if trade policy is the tool, as referred here, through which we can change a little bit the world, we should have these agreements in force to be credible actors. I would say that sustainability agenda and other issues are part of unilateralism, and right so. But there also one word of caution, perhaps, that how much can we burden our trade agreements to keep the original idea of trade there inside. If we have too many conditions, we don't get any agreement through. But after saying that, we need those articles, and we need to push for a better world, and we need to push for sustainability and climate change. But just I would like to highlight the fact that this is something new, and we have to find a way. We're asking quite a lot of third countries who trade with us, and perhaps one idea to the discussion that do we give support enough to comply? And this is in our systems always a bit difficult because trade departments, trade and development cooperation departments make development cooperation. So that could we get a bit support from the development side to help these countries to comply with our conditions, with our sustainability agenda, for example. And Peter, this applies also to the Commission, where we have different departments. Then my last point is, second last, I have still two, but very brief. My second point is on open strategic autonomy. We cannot pretend that we are cut off from the rest of the world. And yes, we agree. Straight liberals nowadays as well, we have moved here, so that we have to diversify, we have to have strategic autonomy. But our way, perhaps, thinking it is that we have to diversify, but at the same time search for new markets, as Peter has already and Claire also said, and to have safer supply chains. But we can't actually be self-sufficient. It's too expensive. As a small country, again, it needs a lot of subsidies, and we just can't afford it. My final point is single market, European single market. We have to deepen it, to develop it, because that makes us much more interesting in outside world. If we have well-functioning internal market, so that when you enter, you can sell to all your 27 member states. That is important. Single market is now next year 30 years old, and we should actually plan for the next 30 years and to deepen our internal market in services and many other fields where we still have some difficulties. So totally, I'm not differing from Claire's view, but I'm adding a bit more liberal view. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Ambassador. So we've heard the neutral EU Commission overview presentation. Very interesting to me is to hear how difficult this must have been within the EU and the slight nuances and the balancing act that you've had to go through. We're now turning to our last speaker, Steve Coe, who's online. Steve, as Harri mentioned, is a partner with the US law firm of Aiken Gump, and in his previous life was also working for the US government, the US trade representative. And it will be interesting to hear his views, looking at all of this from the outside. And what I've been hearing is, or what I'd like to hear from you is, do you look at this as good cop assertiveness, like welcome assertiveness, or does it look more like bad cop unilateralism?
A lot of it really does depend on where you sit, I suppose. But thank you very much, Jos, for that introduction, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this very august panel. My view is, as you say, will be somewhat American, somewhat private sector. And having spent the whole week this week at the WTO at the public forum, will be also sprinkled with lots of rah-rah multilateralism. But that said, I do understand why the EU is doing what it's doing with all of these new tools in the toolbox. Just as I understand why the US in the last 6 years have done what it's done. Not necessarily agreeing with all that, but there is an understanding. I mean, I watched the last 6 years the United States acting very differently than what it did previously because of China, and now I am watching this now, seeing how the EU is acting like the United States. This is just my views, of course. It doesn't reflect any of my clients or my former employer or my current employer. But I have to say, from the US point of view, looking at what the EU has done, we really have no complaints because the US has done all of these things before and continues to do all of these. We have pushed America first. You don't call it that, and frankly, the Biden administration doesn't call it that, but really it is putting, choosing winners and losers, and we have chosen ourselves as not the losers, at least. And unfortunately, this also means a lot of other countries are following suit, not just the EU, not just the US. There are these similar assertive approaches, I guess, from one point of view. The other is the unilateral approach. And it's couched in the same language that I've heard in the last several years. The US talks about maintaining American values. The US talks about national security, human rights, protecting the environment for a lot of what they do, but a lot of it also is inherently based on an existential concern of existentially not being the top producer anymore, not being able to drive the bus. National security, it's used to explain Section 232, which I know many have been concerned about. Human rights have been used to explain a lot of our import bans. Climate change is being used right now to explain our subsidies on electric vehicles, on semiconductors. Again, that's a national security issue as well. So there, you can link all of that to allow these rational reasons. But the question is really the implementation. And, it's one thing to say it, it's another to really do. And I think some people will look at this very differently than the way the governments will look at them. And then they will very carefully look at how governments implement. The big fight right now among the private sector in the US is against the investment screen. The investment screen, the proposal right now in the US is that it is a national security based process that is focused on just critical industries. But critical industries, every time you talk about it, the government seems to expand the view of critical industries wider and wider. It's no longer just semiconductors or AI, but it can be also pharmaceuticals, it can be future energy efficiency products, all of that, so all of a sudden becomes part of the issue. And again, subsidization, we're not new at that, but we do now couch subsidization in the form of maintaining our national security concerns. So more and more, at least in the US, we can't complain about what the EU is doing. But we certainly at some point will not be able to complain about what China is doing either, because what we do in the US awfully looks a lot like what China has been doing. And there's been quite a lot of literature about this from think tanks, about the concerns of basically moving more and more towards that pattern that for some, maybe not for everybody, but for some looks like industrial policy. Some looks like picking winners and losers. I think my hope is in looking at this is that these tools will be used very narrowly. These tools will be used very in a very targeted manner, and not one that continues to broaden out. I don't think we can stop the tools from being used. They are reactionary tools. They're, Yoshi asked the question, why now? Why not before? And I think we know the reason why, because we're seeing the rise of state capitalism. We're seeing the rise of artificial policies, industrial policies, certainly not market-based. And so that's why the US did what it's doing, and I would assume that's why the EU now is doing what it's doing. But let's, still try to maintain some level, I would hope, of ensuring some multilateralism, some rule of law. You can't take a multilateralism and say, well, this part of multilateralism works for us, but that part does not. And it just doesn't work anymore. I think that is the picking and choosing of which part of the international regime works for you and the other parts that don't, or it's too old, and so I'm not going to follow it anymore. I think those are difficult positions to take, and then expect others then to follow the parts of the multilateral regime that you want, but they will say that doesn't work for them. The anti-coercion issue, I find that interesting. I can see how it's useful, but I don't think any of us has clean hands. We are big economies with a lot of leverage that we, some will say, have the right to be able to push that around. I mean, it's a difference in rhetoric between saying, if you do X, then we won't give you Y. That doesn't sound so good, but if you say, if you don't do X, we will give you Y, well, that sounds more like an incentive, like a carrot, but it really results in the same situation where for some will look like economic coercion. So lastly, I will say this. I hope that leaders currently in the multilateral system, the EU, the US, will try to lead more by example, less by rhetoric. So the examples really matter. What is put in place will really matter. We don't want to be in a situation, I don't think, to be able to basically affirm to the rest of the world that industrial policy works, economic coercion works, but that leveling the playing field and adhering to the rule of law, for some reason, just does not matter anymore. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Steve. And very interesting how you make the parallel between what the EU is now doing and what the US has been doing for a while, or even what China is doing in terms of industrial policy. Just a footnote, and I kind of implied from what Claire was saying that unilateral by definition is illegal or wrong. At least from my perspective, I would say unilateral is just something you can do without the approval of others, and it doesn't mean it's necessarily illegal. The other thing that I would throw in defense of unilateralism, if you want to call it this, is that if you look at the US practice in the 1980s, 1990s, this was arguably what one could call benign unilateralism, because they really pushed forward reforms at a multilateral level. Had the US not done certain things unilaterally, I don't think we would ever have had a WTO or binding dispute settlement. So I think that there's also benefits in a little bit more assertiveness.